I guess God could have done it differently. Life in this world could be perfectly ordered, with nothing unexpected or tragic or out of place. No calamities such as Job suffered, never a surprise of any kind, just a predictable universe ticking along like a clockwork toy. And all of us bored out of our minds. Carol Newsom takes us right into Job's dispute with God. And in these chapters, we're going to see that the very capriciousness and arbitrariness that can bring tragedy, the unpredictability that Job actually holds against God, is the opposite side of everything that makes creation a miracle. We can't have one without the other. The same glorious unpredictability that means that no two ocean waves will ever break in exactly the same way has got to allow for the possibility of the unwanted and the feared and the tragic too.
Last week, we talked about Job's contradictory experience of God. He believes that God is a God of justice, yet he's also certain that God has been treating him unjustly and cruelly. Consequently, the friend's advice that he examine his moral life and humbly turn to God in prayer is no help to Job. However valid this advice might be for someone else in different circumstances, it does not speak to Job's pain. Job is on his own to figure out a new way to speak about God and to God. You may have noticed that Job's speeches begin to use language that sounds like legal speech. From chapter 9 onward, Job talks about whether it might be possible for him to come to trial with God. In chapter 13, he says he wants to argue his case with God, and that if he gets to do this, he's certain he will be vindicated. He also speaks in chapter 16 of a heavenly witness who might testify for him. The image of a trial with God comes to a climax in chapter 23, as Job vividly imagines how the trial will unfold, and in chapter 31, where he swears his great oath. Does Israelite tradition have any precedent for this idea of a trial with God, or is Job suggesting something radically new? The Old Testament does have examples of people arguing with God over matters of justice. Abraham, Moses, and Jeremiah all argue with God, though none of them cast the argument in terms of a legal trial. Job is doing something new in thinking about his confrontation with God in terms of a legal trial. New images and new metaphors can be important in religious experience. They can help people organize chaotic and confused feelings into a clearer picture. So it is with Job. The disasters that have fallen upon him feel like an accusation by God and punishment from God for some guilty deed. But Job knows himself to be innocent. In turn, Job thinks God is guilty, both of falsely accusing him and of attacking him so violently that he's likely to die. In short, God is guilty of attempted murder. And yet, Job believes God is fundamentally a just God. So what better way to clarify the situation than by imagining both parties coming together to state their cases and then decide who is in the right and who is in the wrong? If God is just, then God will listen and act fairly in a trial. The image of a trial with God is a powerful one, and more suited to addressing Job's experience of suffering than is the advice of the friends. But what are the unspoken assumptions and implications of this powerful image Job is using? What image of God does it presuppose? Job imagines a God who would say, in effect, "You, Job, are innocent, and consequently, I, God, am guilty of having treated you unjustly." Is this thinkable? In the Old Testament, it is possible to talk about God as changing God's mind, repenting of some action. And some of the psalmists and the prophets do bring before God the anguish they feel at injustice in a world God supposedly rules. But nowhere else in the Bible does anyone imagine a scene such as Job seems to have in mind. Perhaps the problem with Job's model lies less with its image of God than with its understanding of the meaning of suffering. The traditional understanding of suffering was subtle and flexible. Curiously, Job seems to have a very narrow understanding of the meaning of suffering. He assumes his suffering is sent by God. So either it is justified as a punishment for sin, or it's unjustified and so amounts to abuse by God. Either or. His assumption restricts him to one limited way of seeing things. Many readers, caught up by Job's passion and powerful way of speaking, are disappointed, even angry, when they get to the speeches of God from the whirlwind. God doesn't seem to answer Job. But perhaps Job is not asking the right question, so there is no way to answer him on his own terms. In answering Job, God reframes the issues. Now, it is true, God rebukes Job's arrogance with those strong rhetorical questions. Where were you? Do you know? Can you do this or that? What God is doing is asserting that God is God and Job is not. But God seems also to be redirecting Job's vision, showing him something about the world Job cannot see. But what? God's speeches are not easy to understand. They can be interpreted in more than one way. But we may get some glimpse of what God is showing Job if we look at the images God uses and contrast them with Job's way of thinking. Job understands the world and his situation in terms of legal right and wrong. But God speaks instead of creation and of the chaotic. The description begins with images of the foundations of the earth, the designing of the world as an architect might design a building. God speaks of the regular and orderly functioning of light and darkness, snow and rain. But God also speaks of the presence of chaotic and fearful elements within this created world. The sea was a traditional image of forces that threaten to dissolve the structures of creation. God refers to the sea as unruly, but also as having a boundary beyond which it cannot come upon the land. Similarly, when God describes the wild animals, it's important for us to remember how the ancients thought about them. They did not see wild animals as endangered species, but as creatures who belonged to the frightening realm of the desolate wilderness. The towns and villages and farmland were the safe places. The wilderness, in contrast, was symbolically associated with the chaotic. Yet God speaks of taking care of just these strange and separate creatures. The imagery reaches a climax in the descriptions of the terrifying monsters, Behemoth and Leviathan. Like the chaotic sea, with which they're often associated, they are part of God's world, but they too have their limits and boundaries. What is Job, and what are we to make of this? God doesn't spell it out, but what God says is relevant to the issue of suffering. Our task is to reflect on the images and their implications. It is true, I believe, that not all suffering can be reduced to legal right or wrong, to punishment or abuse. Diseases and accidents, violence and tragedy exist. Fearful and chaotic experiences are simply a part of the world and of our lives. God insists that Job acknowledge this. But even more important, God shows Job a world in which the chaotic is present, but is not all there is, and it is not unrestrained. Instead, God is there, creating and maintaining, pushing back the darkness every morning, setting a limit to the sea, bringing rain and new growth even into the desolate places. In these speeches, God does not provide a rational explanation for suffering. That cannot be done. But God allows Job a new way of looking at the world and at his relationship to God, one that goes beyond categories of blame and guilt. God offers Job a way to situate suffering within a sustaining and renewing creation. God offers Job a way to be reconciled instead of alienated. Many readers find the conclusion of the book, the happy ending, to be jarring. But perhaps if it is read as a symbol of reconciliation and new beginning, then it may provide a fitting conclusion to the story of Job.
I don't know about you, but when I listen to people like Carol Newsom, I'm sometimes quite overwhelmed by the majesty and the mystery of Scripture. What a gift for living.